All right, everyone, welcome back to our series. This is our Back to Basics series where we're just kind of talking through our frameworks for building out your plan to financial independence. This is probably the fifth or maybe even sixth part in this series, and we'll try to have some of the other episodes linked up for you in the show notes. But most recently, in episode 272, which you can access at choosefi.com/272, we talked about the amazing power of understanding how and why compound interest works the way it does. We did a little compare and contrast with compound interest versus simple interest versus just saving in your coffee can. But now, what we are going to do is continue that conversation and tie it to this idea of how to start investing in banking and the differences between the two, how to get started, how to set up your financial life. Welcome to the ultimate crowdsourced personal finance show. This is ChooseFI. All right, guys, really excited to dive into this today, and I thought we could start with actually my co-host Brad here with me today, and we could start with Brad. How did you actually go about setting up your financial life?
Yeah, that is a good question. I think like so many of us, it's all right, what did my parents do? Right? What advice did I get from my coworker in the next cube over or something like that? And I remember the nervousness and trepidation as, a recent college grad, just having this idea of, hey, I want to get this set up, I want to save, but I don't know what to do. And I actually remember like viscerally this experience. And I don't think I've ever mentioned this on the podcast before, but so my first job, so we were actually in a building that was actually like one of the big corporate banks. And I remember wanting to open up a Roth IRA. Now, again, as I've talked about a lot of times on the show, one of those lightning bolt inflection moments for me in my life was when I had this summer internship and I learned about compound interest, right? And specifically with a Roth IRA of, oh, wow, I could be a billionaire by the time I'm 105 or, it was like this absurd thing, but just seeing the power of compound interest. And it always made me understand that I needed to start saving as early as I could. So I, like I said, I literally remember this moment of going down to this big corporate bank and standing in line and then getting hooked up with this investment advisor, right? And it was, I was a 22-year-old kid. I had my $5,000 or whatever it was at the time. It might have been, this is dating me, it might have been $3,000. And just saying, hey, I want to open up a Roth IRA, but I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know what to invest in. I really need your help. And the person was, to me, nice enough, helpful enough. But little did I know, Jonathan, that they invested me in something with a 5% upfront load on this, which 5%. So I got dinged 5% of what I invested just basically went as a straight commission, more or less. Like, luckily, these things don't exist quite so much anymore. But Jonathan, talk about like just treating me as chum in the water or prey, right? Like this person saw somebody who was inexperienced and they had a couple different options, right? They could treat me like their son or daughter, or they could treat me as a quick payday. And sadly, they treated me as a quick payday. And that was a fund and that I really couldn't get out of for a while. There was some kind of like insane like vesting period. It was something ludicrous that, again, luckily we largely don't have to deal with these things anymore. And this is not to paint a broad brush that all investment advisors are bad or by any means, but this was an experience that I think has probably replicated millions of times over that intervening 20 years. And if you and I can help people feel more confident, knowing what to do with their investing, their banking, their credit card relationships, and how to set these things up, how to set them up with ideally no fees, but minimal fees, I guess at worst, let's say, then I think we've probably done a really great service to the world at large because it doesn't have to be that hard. It doesn't have to be expensive. And we can all move forward without that nervousness that I know people feel because I felt it. I know what that's like.
Yeah, you're exactly right, Brad. I mean, I think, and I don't think that that was just in your time period. I think there are actually a lot of companies that still charge, either, and there's actually different types of fees, right? There's a front load fee, meaning in your case, Brad, this is what you experience. It is a fee that you have to pay in order to get into this investment that you want to get into. In your case, you wanted to fund a Roth IRA, you took them $100. And, if there was a 5% fee, that means that only 95 made it into the investment. If you had done $1,000, that means that only 950 made it into the investment. There's other types of fees. There is potentially you having an agent, them charging you an assets under management fee. I'm going to manage your money, but they're going to charge you maybe 1% or 2% to, manage that money for you, to make decisions about when to get in, when to get out, to give you financial advice. And then there's expense ratios potentially. So what do they put you in? Those funds, are they expensive to own? They're considered actively managed funds. So you have to pay the management, the team, that sort of thing. That can be very, very expensive. And then in some cases, because you could have one of these, some of these, all of these, there could be a surrender charge. So if you want to get out of the fund, it needs to be in there a certain period of time. If you want to get out before the period of time, there is a surrender charge. Man, I mean, it's important to just kind of understand the variables that could potentially be in play. That way, we don't wait until we're inside this bank for the first time, talking to this person for the first time, to know what type of fund we want to be in. We really don't want to get our advice from a stranger that's helping us. We don't want to go in blind. That it can be too expensive.
Yeah, agreed. So, all right, let's take a step back and do high level here, right? So, if you were advising, let's say, a cousin of yours or some such, right? A buddy of yours who's just getting started, and they wanted to set up a financial life, what would be the pillars that you would say, like at a high level, and then what would be maybe the first action step?
Awesome. Okay, yeah, this is perfect. I've had siblings do this. I've had friends message me, and I think it usually starts with our banking, right? We'll talk about our investments here, but it's like layer one, your financial life is, do you have a banking system set up? I was working with this one individual and they actually didn't. They were doing check cashing, and they were just, and in this case, this individual was in a paycheck to paycheck place. But like starting from understanding what type of bank you want to have, what are the advantages or disadvantages of a checking versus a savings? Why might you want to have one or both of those? Does it need to be a physical bank? What are the variables that you would want to consider? Brad, I'll actually give this back to you. I think most conversations start with like, all right, do you have your banking figured out yet?
Yeah, I think that is the right place to start. So, as I see it, and this may be maybe a little antiquated, but I think not. Like, to me, the checking account is first and foremost. That's what you need to lock down. This is going to be your most significant account where things come into and out of. And I think we will talk about automating these systems, but I think how I do it is I set up that one account as kind of like a clearinghouse for any income that's coming in and any type of expenses. So I'll consider that the account that I would pay my credit cards out of. I will set that as the auto pay account for some utilities that will just automatically draft from your checking account. So for me, I look at that as like the lifeblood of my financial life on a month to month basis. Now, naturally, this is not the place where I'm storing all of my assets, right? Like we will talk about that further, but this is where, okay, on a month to month basis, when I have some understanding of what does my life cost, when does my income come in, right? When are my paychecks coming in, or whatever it may be, whatever your life situation looks like, and when are those expenses set to come out? And in a lot of cases, you can set these things up, right? So with a credit card, you can usually pick what day of the month you set up your auto pay for, right? Or even your statement close. So these are options that you have. But I think, Jonathan, this is probably the one instance where, especially at the beginning, when someone's setting up their financial life. So as you know, I'm not a huge budgeter, right? That's never been my thing. It obviously is your thing, and many, many, many tens of millions of people use a budget religiously, and I get that. I think if I were setting up my financial life at the beginning, if I were starting over, I think having that idea of that budget, of when these things are going to hit, I think that's the most important aspect, because I think my whole guiding light with my personal finances and the system that I set up is simplicity and stress mitigation, right? So I don't want to be concerned that, oh no, my $95 electric bill is coming. Am I going to have enough money in the account? if I ever got to a scenario where I'm worried about the timing of a $95 bill or even a $600 credit card bill, something probably went wrong in my planning. So again, that's how I set up my life, that this all works on autopilot. And most importantly, I'm never stressing. So I probably, and now this is down the road a little bit. This is not for someone starting out on day one, but I personally would set this up to have a couple extra $1,000 in that checking account. So I didn't have to constantly be stressing and looking at my account every single day and freaking out about the exact dollars and cents. Now, I think that to me is kind of the framework that I'd approach this with.
Yeah, there's an interesting point in there that I think you do this without actually even verbalizing it, but I am not living on this month's paycheck, right? YNAB, You Need a Budget, does a really good job kind of creating a language around this, but intuitively you can appreciate if you're waiting till you get this month's paycheck to pay the bills, then you're already kind of behind. You're already a little bit behind. Everything needs to map out. If you're paying this month's bills with last month's paycheck, your money's older. It's been in your bank for 20 or 30 days. When this one hits, this is for the following month's bills. So it's just that this is kind of the way that I think through this, and I think it's valuable. In terms of we talk about emergency funds and everything else, but I'm kind of like you, Brad. Increasingly, what I do is um, the central bank account for my wife and I, that is the landing pad. It's a clearinghouse. It's so to keep my life very, very simple. I'm living on the paycheck from the previous month. So I'm not waiting on this month's paycheck to pay the bills. Very, very important. Living on the paycheck from last month. And then I might have upwards of maybe an additional month's worth of cash. So if your life costs $5,000 a month, there's probably gonna be somewhere between five to $10,000 in the bank account, somewhere in that range. And then once I know that that's it, there's plenty of margin there, there's plenty of room there. Anything beyond that is now going into something other than my banking account. It's going to the next layer, whether that is a savings account, which we could talk about, if it's an investment account, which we're clearly about to get into. Really, it's just the first layer is my checking account. That's cash flow. It's not even really an emergency fund because as you get farther on this path, you don't really have as many quote unquote emergencies. Um, you've already got a lot of cash, like things that were emergencies earlier on this journey really aren't. They're just fungible cash flow issues, and you can solve that with 2 or 3 days bandwidth. So that's kind of the framework. What purpose does your checking account serve? And Brad, before we move on checking account to these others, there's a few best practices for setting up your checking account to avoid fees that I think that we should talk about, and also to keep your life very, very simple.
Yeah. So the way that I approach this, and I try to minimize fees as much as possible in every aspect of my life. So what I did, I set up the most basic checking account possible where you need to have the smallest minimum balance to not have any type of monthly fee. I know many accounts offer no monthly fee regardless of balance, but I think when I initially set this account up, I needed something like a $1,000 average balance or some such to have no monthly fees. So I think I would look at multiple layers of fees. So is there a monthly fee? You really, unless in some crazy special circumstance that I can't even brainstorm right now, you're not going to want to pay any type of monthly fee. You can find a bank that very, very easily that offers accounts without fees. So that's real simple. I think you want to avoid any type of overdraft fees. Now, hopefully, if we set this up properly, if you set up your financial life properly, you're never getting into a situation where you're overdrafting your account, where you're drawing more money than you have, right? So that's the backbone of this. But even just setting up systems where you can generally ask them to remove that option. So if you try to take out additional money through an ATM card or a debit card or whatever it may be, you just simply cannot overdraft your account. So I would just shut that off entirely. I know that's something that I did when I originally set this account up years ago. I think ATM fees are another kind of convenience fee, right? Like I love that term, convenience fee. It's basically a fee on laziness, right? It's with to not to be too nice here, but that's what it really is, right? It's a fee on laziness, and you should not be paying ATM fees. Really, you should not be using cash all that much in to begin with. I think I can probably go through 6 months without spending more than $30 in cash. But even if you're someone who does use cash, which is perfectly fine, no judgments here, certainly, but just plan ahead. Don't be lazy. Go to your bank and take out X number of dollars, right? So you're not just scrambling. I think the enemy of so much of what we do here, that drift state, is the scramble, right? Jonathan, we talk about this when it comes to eating. If you haven't planned your meals ahead, you find yourself in that last minute scramble. And what does that amount to? It amounts to, hey, let's go run and grab the $10 per pound hot food at the local grocery store, or let's go grab takeout or whatever it may be. It's that scramble. So I would argue it's the exact same thing when it comes to your personal finances. You never want to be in a situation where you're paying someone a fee because you didn't plan ahead. So yeah, Jonathan, those are the couple fees that jump out to me. Anything I missed?
I like the idea about overdraft. Let me add on to that. One, you could do the shut off, but two is in many cases you can connect it to a credit card. So like if you don't want it to be declined, if you go over, you'll get the alert. It'll go over into the credit card, and then you just pay the normal credit card interest rate. So that's one slight little extra optimization to potentially consider. Obviously, don't do that, but at the same point, definitely don't pay a $35 overdraft fee on an $80 transaction. That's crazy. That's crazy. Even if it's $150. Anyways, that's one. Two, you mentioned the direct deposit. I'm sorry, you mentioned the minimum balance needed in the account. Definitely be aware of the terms and conditions on your account. But the other aspect, a lot of them, it's minimum balance, but the other one is and direct deposit. So I don't know why anybody would want to just do their checks manually at this point if they could do direct deposit, but you should be aware many banks will incentivize that. So check to see if your banks will incentivize the direct deposit by removing any sort of monthly maintenance fees. And then on your ATM fees that you mentioned, great point. Um, yeah, I usually just go to the bank and have some cash for a period of time if I'm going to do that. But some banks, especially the ones that have more of an online focus, like USAA as an example, will offer ATM reimbursement because they don't have any physical ATMs anywhere in the country. So if you were to use an ATM, that's going to be a Wells Fargo, Bank of America, but your checking or savings is at USAA, they will refund you up to $15 a month in ATM fees. And that seems to be kind of par for the course with a lot of the online banks. They don't have a lot of the brick and mortar cost of some of these banks that you're probably more familiar with their names. So it's worth being aware of. So yeah, it's just kind of a couple quick optimizations. Get that in place, set up your bills, understand what your life costs. And then now we're kind of moving into the next layer of this other financial tools. And maybe we have some options that are traditional ones that you might find in a bank, like savings accounts and CDs. I personally don't really have a lot of experience with CDs. It's not one I personally use, but we should just mention it in passing. And then from there, we'll probably taking a look at, as an individual getting started setting up their financial life, they're thinking now about investment. So Brad, why don't we start with savings accounts? How do savings accounts pair with checking accounts in your mind?
Yeah. So this actually ties in directly to something you mentioned in passing a handful of minutes ago, which is you said very quickly, if I can get money in 2 or 3 days. And I think to someone starting out, they might not have necessarily known what you meant, but I think this is a critical point, and I'm so glad you mentioned it. That I think that's really what we're doing here. So any type of account, like I said, I'm not keeping all of my financial assets obviously in my checking account. I'm keeping whatever I need, like you said, for a month or two, and then my other assets are in various different places. Now, originally in my kind of investing life, I did use a savings account, and that was just with my Globo Bank at that point, and it was
Globo
just
Bank.
a savings account that was essentially the this connected to my checking. I could really easily make transfers. So that savings, the interest rate on my quote unquote savings account at the big bank was minuscule. I think, it's probably effectively zero, maybe a tenth of 1%. So I don't know really at this point why they're keeping that charade up, but
It's just
nevertheless,
a checking account with less access.
yeah, exactly. A much less useful checking. I think in the advent of online savings accounts, that are not generally speaking, not with that same bank, you have multiple different options. I know we've talked about CIT Bank here. Often, I know, again, this is dating me, but I used ING Bank originally when, 20 years ago when I started my investing life. And it was a place to store my additional money that I wasn't investing at that point because, frankly, I wasn't investing. So it was at that point, and this will sound crazy, it was a 5% interest rate on the online savings account. And, now it's obviously a fraction of that. But that gave me the option. And again, going back to your point of 2 or 3 days. So if I needed access to that money, since it's in savings, if I needed access to it for an emergency or whatever it may be, I could transfer that money to my checking account that I had linked up, right? Just using the account number and the routing number, super easy. You're linking it up, and those banks then talk to each other. So I can send money back and forth. And in general terms, it's going to take, I've seen it as quickly as 1 business day. That's pretty rare. 2 to 3 business days, I think, would be pretty standard. Pretty rare to be more than that. So I think if you're looking at, okay, what is an absolute emergency? Do I need the money in more than do I need the money quicker than 2 or 3 business days? If so, then maybe you consider that savings account with the same bank because that would generally happen maybe intraday or at worst the next day. So that's, when we talk about opportunity cost, what are you giving up? So the opportunity cost of having that linked account is maybe 1 or 2 days transfer. But in my entire adult lifetime, I cannot think of one scenario where that 1 or 2 days ever made a difference. So for me, it was well worth getting the additional interest rate rather than just keeping it in that, glorified checking account with less access, as you call it.
This is a point that it's really worth highlighting right now in that what is the purpose of a savings account, both in the short term and in the long term, because it changes. A savings account, I guess theoretically, it was supposed to offer this great interest rate that would be better than what you'd get in a checking account. It's a good place to keep your savings. It's going to be needed in the short to medium term. But the best bank accounts in the world right now, savings accounts in the world, the highest interest rate savings account in the world. I mean, CIT is probably one of the higher end ones. So ChooseFI.com/CIT. It used to be around 2%. It's now at 0.45%. So to your point, Brad, it's 45 times better than what you were getting with your Globo Bank. 45 times better. But I mean, Brad, if you were saving $100,000 and you held it there for 1 year and you got a 0.45% interest rate, how much is that interest rate worth to you right now?
Yeah, Jonathan. So on 100 grand, if you're saying it's 0.45% of an interest rate, that would be $450. But I guess the delta, the difference here would be if we're talking versus 0.01%. So it would be $440 difference, which it's not nothing,
Okay.
certainly.
All right. So fair enough. Fair enough. If you have 100K and you're planning on keeping it in savings, you should probably have it in an institution like a CIT that's giving you the market rate of 0.45%. So that money would make $450 over the period of year compared to Brad's Globo situation where you got $1. Now, yeah, I know I'm a little cynical on both of these at this point, but I wanted to let you know that's actually by design. These are all tied to the government's prevailing interest rate at any particular point in time. These banks don't just make up an interest rate based on how generous they're feeling. Banks make money by allowing you to keep your money with them, and then they re-lend that out to people based on the labor rate plus some percentage interest rate. So they're making money on your money. Every bank wants you to have your money invested with them so they can loan it out and make a higher interest rate, and then you pay a version of that. When the government's interest rate, prevailing interest rate at the time is really, really low, like we are now, virtually zero, there's not as much margin for them to move. And the reason that the government lowers the interest rate is exactly this, to encourage individuals to invest in the market. Now, I'm sure there's other reasons, but like this is all one big circle. And we just have to figure out, we don't have control over all these variables. We have to figure out what we're going to do. Not very compelling to put $100,000 into a savings account when you're making 0.01% or even 0.45%. Now, we'll work through that in just a second, but I just wanted to say that this is not like, it's not a surprise that the interest rates are low right now, that the savings rates are low right now. Typically, when the market is super compelling, everybody's in the market. It's a bull market. It's unbelievable. It'll only go up, blah, 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 blah. The banks are really the government starts raising the interest rate, and the banks start raising their interest rates to get you to consider moving some of your money back to them. It's a supply and demand issue. Right now, People are leery of the market. They want to be in banks. When people are super bullish on the market, they think the market's going to go nothing but straight up. Banks are trying to get you to come back in. They raise the rate. There's a dynamic between these two that always exists. And we have to figure out what that means for us practically because our investing, and we're going to get back into investing now, our investing goals are basically set up by one, we need to have our cash flow figured out. And then two, we need to figure out what sort of safety net we need for ourselves. What sort of emergency fund? What sort of backbone do we need? And then where does that emergency fund need to be? And then what is our time horizon? How quickly do we need this money? Listen, if I had $100,000 and in 5 days from now, I need $100,000, I'm going to have that money in cash sitting on the sidelines in a savings account because I need to make sure there's no variance in the amount because I need that $100,000 on such and such day. If I don't need that $100,000 for maybe 10, 15, 20 years, I frankly probably couldn't afford to have it in a savings account because over time, that interest rate I'm making isn't even keeping up with inflation. My money is getting less valuable over time. It's costing me money to have my money parked in the savings account because it could be making more potentially, not guaranteed. It could be making more in the market and hopefully beating inflation. So we need to make probably somewhere between 1% to 3% on our money just to maintain the value of our money over periods of time. So this is kind of the interplay of what we're looking at. You're like, well, if you had like $1 million, you could just have all that in the savings account. Well, maybe, maybe I don't know if that's exactly what I would advise, but I'm not giving financial advice. I'm just telling you what entertainment, just kind of a general way of thinking through this. Um, but that's the thing. If you just have $1 million sitting in your checking account and they're giving you 0.45%, and now you're making what, $4,500, Brad, based on that math, you're making
Yeah.
$4,500 each year. But inflation is rising at 2% or 3%. Your $1 million is having the purchasing power of 2 to 3% less each year. That's probably not going to work out very well for you. So we have to find a balance that allows us to match up what our goals are, what our time horizon is with our risk tolerance and our understanding of the variables, which is why it's very important that we're doing this episode now after building on it and the episode that we just did. That was episode, Brad, I believe 276, 275.
Yeah. This is 276.
Yeah, so episode 275, just this past Friday, where we talk about wargaming your risk tolerance out. We have to kind of figure out some of those variables so we know how much do we need to have in savings account if we're going to have money in savings account, and at what point do we need to go to investing. Brad, do you want to add any commentary or flavor onto that? Anything that you think that I missed or could be more circumspect on?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think when people are talking about bank accounts, and I know we're going to kind of move on to other aspects of our financial lives here, I think one thing that we have not mentioned is to ensure that you're at like a legitimate bank is to look for FDIC insurance. So this is just kind of the hallmark of, am I at a fly by night organization or am I at a bank that is legitimate in the eyes of the federal government here in the US? So uh, basically FDIC insurance, as I'm reading a quote here, it's backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government. It covers depositors of a failed FDIC insured depository institution. So essentially, if your bank failed, the federal government is there to insure this money. So that is really a critical thing that you're looking for. And it's up to, I think it's $250,000 right now per person, per institution, or per account. So if you had a joint account, that would actually be up to $500,000. Now, naturally, you should not, in all likelihood, have $500,000 sitting in your bank, as you just mentioned, Jonathan. But again, this is not us giving advice by any means. But yeah, that's something I would look for. And yeah, just really consider, do you need a savings account? I think we've talked in depth about savings accounts, but at this point, I think this will tie into where we go with investing accounts about, again, that 2 to 3 day transfer, right? If you have the ability to have money in an investing account with no matter where it is, Vanguard, Schwab, Fidelity, whoever, if you have the ability to get that money back to your checking account in an emergency in 2, 3, or 4 business days, then that might remove the need to have a savings account. And I think clearly the big takeaway here is you need to have a checking account. I think that's going to be the main hub of your financial life on a week to week, month to month basis. But you really then need to consider, okay, all this other money that I have, all these savings, what do I do with it?
Yeah, and Some people need to sleep at night. They need a ton of cash sitting in a savings account. Other individuals, they are very, very aggressive, and there's not a right or a wrong answer here. In some cases, both individuals will look like geniuses. I mean, just different time periods, different situations. There's a but the key is not that we just don't know. With hindsight, we'll know exactly what you should have done. But since we don't know how things will map out, we need to pick something that lets us sleep at night and gives us the best chance for being happy with our choice. Right? It's a little bit of a trade off here. So we've got our checking account mapped out. We've got a couple months of cash flow. We have a savings account for maybe things that we think we might need in the near term. Maybe it's getting a slightly better interest rate. We're probably not sitting on $1 million in our savings account because, to your point, Brad, at that point, even the extra tiny bit of protection we have, which is, oh, if it's in a savings account, it's FDIC insured. So if the bank goes away or it fails or something really bad happens, the government is insuring it. If you're past that 250,000 as an individual or 500,000 as a married couple, you're largely already past the limits of what you would have had anyways. You're not even getting that insurance protection at that point. So I do know a couple individuals that are sitting on upwards of seven figures and checking. I'm like, oh, I don't know. You do you, but I'm just saying. Uh,
And your advice as a dutiful friend would be to split it across different banks then, right?
different
Because that
banks.
would be
Yeah, good
that would
call.
be the obvious option.
Eh,
It's per institution. But yeah, clearly, hopefully there's one person out
mul-
of a million that's doing
multiple layers to that suggestion. It's like
there's always more information.
it's
There's
all,
always more information.
it's like, well, what could I get you to do? Yeah, split it across multiple institutions, and then like if I could really get you to do it, like what's the war game that would need you to have it this way? Like, is there something we could give you to help you hedge that where you're not, 100% equities, but also if your worst fears came true, you'd also be happy with the outcome? Because you have a lot of options when you have $1 million in current days money and you're just trying to decide where to best put it to give you the best chances of success. That's not really what we're talking about right now in this conversation. We're talking about how to set up your financial life basically from the beginning. So we have an individual like as a first, they've got their checking account set up, they got their savings account set up. They have a little bit of money going in their savings. Maybe they're saving a couple $100 a month in their savings, something like that. But really, they're ready in their mind to start investing. And so, Brad, if this individual, you knowing what you know now, they're employed, gainfully employed, first job, making a median income, they're saving 20% of their income pretty handily now. That's kind of what they have in mind for starting to invest. Where do they start? What or where should they start looking first?
Yeah. So my piece of advice for where to get started investing would be, especially in that person's case, so is to start with your 401k at your company. I think that is the very clear place to at least start investigating. And I think what we advise is see what your 401k match is, if any, with your employer. And a 401k match is essentially free money. So this is really part of your salary even though it's not termed that. This is free money as part of your overall benefits package. That if you put X amount into your 401k, we'll give just a random example here because every 401k plan is different. So you obviously have to go to HR and figure this out for your own company. But let's say a company could give a 100% match on the first 3% of your income that you put into your 401k. All right. So they are basically trying to incentivize you to save in your 401k. So in that case, let's just use simple numbers. You make 100 grand, right? And you put 3% of your income into your 401k. So $3,000 goes in each year. And because you have a 100% match, which is really very generous in this hypothetical here, your company is giving you $3,000 on top of that 3,000. So you would have $6,000 put into your 401k. Again, 3,000 coming out of your salary, right? And 3,000 that the company is just giving you for free. So I think my strong advice would be, if you possibly can, do everything possible to put enough into your 401k to, at minimum, get that employer match.
Yeah, if you hear employer match, what you should be reading is, hey, would you like to be paid more or less? It's binary. There's nothing in between.
Yep. Yep. More, please.
All right. So start there. Yes, absolutely do that. You will never get a better return than that, a guaranteed return better than that. And we can talk about then how much should I invest? You guys know how we feel about savings rate and just trying to, more generally more is better. We can do incremental. There's ways that you can like game this out yourself where on a lot of 401ks, if you like aren't sure what percentage you can afford and how painful it's going to be, you can just tick the box that says increase my contributions by 1% each year. Most 401k plan, because 1% you won't even notice it. Your raises will probably increase it. You'll never even notice it. And it's pretty powerful just to check that one box and know it's on autopilot. Ideally, we'd like to be a little bit more aggressive. And as we're able, start working towards what percentage of my income do I need to contribute in order to hit the max that I can contribute each year? You may not be there right out the gate, but these are the ways. But there's an actual process here. Like your HR does not have the secrets of investing. That is not their purpose. They are not a financial advisor unless you work in a school. And in that case, you should be very nervous because the very always available advisor that's there, sadly, in many cases, is selling insurance products. And they're offering their services to school for free, which again, you remember our earlier conversation, free in that case, usually you're the product. You got to be very, very careful. More episodes coming up on that in the near future, but you need to do your due diligence. Anyways, Brad, we talked about the vehicle. So we said 401k, and that's actually an important distinction for teachers and people in public service, or it might have a slightly different name. They don't have access to a 401k. They might have access to a 403b, or alternatively, and in many cases, if you listen to episode 13 of our podcast, a 457B. These are just a couple of the vehicles that are out there. They largely fulfill the same purpose, at least when you first start looking at them. They allow you to fund your retirement accounts with pre-tax dollars, and certainly all the way up to the point of that match totally makes sense. And then you start figuring out how much more do you want to contribute to hopefully get the limits. So, Brad, we're coming into the tail end of 2020. Do we know the limits on 401k plans for this year? What is it? What's the max that someone could contribute?
So yeah, the personal amount that you can put in the employee side, and this is not to be confused with the employer side, which is that match, but the employee side, you can put 19,500 in 2020 into your 401k or like you said 403b plans. So that's the employee side, but now that can go over. If let's just say for argument's sake you had this unbelievably generous company that matched dollar for dollar every amount you put in, they could put in the 19,500. You could put in the 19,500 and they could match it for up to 19,500 as well, right? The actual total limit, I think, for 2020 is $57,000. And Jonathan, I'm looking that up quickly. $57,000 for the employee
Wow.
and employer side. And that's obviously extraordinarily rare, but in instances where maybe you own your own company and you can do some interesting things with the employer side. Now, this is obviously much more than FI 101, but it is important to know that there is really the takeaway. There's the employee side and there is the employer side. There's the total amount. So the total sum of that can be that 57,000. But really, for 99.9% of us, the 19,500 is what we need to consider.
Awesome. All right. So most employers, just to anchor yourself to percentages, we commonly see a match somewhere between 3 and 8%. That's a big range even there. But it would not shock me to see that they will match you anywhere from 3 to 8%, fully match it dollar on the dollar. So if you fund 19,500, your total salary was $100,000 a year. They match that first 3 to 4% that you put in. So $3,000 or $4,000, they match that 1-to-1. So they are also funding an additional $3,000 or $4,000 on top of that. So for this, a hypothetical individual, they would have a total contribution to their 401k in the 20,000 range, 22, 23, $24,000. Just something like that. Don't leave this money on the table. Now, for many of you, let's say we have this first individual, they're getting their first job, they're making $60,000 a year. They found out they got the 4% match. So they did that and they're wondering, well, how much would I need to contribute in order to fully max out my 401k? I just ran just a couple calculations here. And for that individual, they're going to be able to fund it somewhere in between, like if they were to contribute somewhere between 30 to 33% of their income, the closest I could get with an even number was 32% of their income. If they put 32% of their income into their 401k, that's what it would take on a $60,000 income. That's what it would take to be able to max out that 401k for the year. That might seem like a stretch, especially when you're starting out the gate, but just in terms of having a framework for kind of what's my percentage if I'm going to start targeting to max out this 401k each year, you're probably going to start with what the match is and start easing your way up, recognizing that at some point you're probably not going to put 100%, of your salary because you need something to live off of in most cases. And but probably right around 25-30% of your income is going to make sure that you're maxing out your 401k, assuming that you've got all your other things figured out so you'd still have enough to live off of.
Yeah, and Jonathan, this is clearly where we get into individual variability, right? And outside of the just this 101 of how do you open up accounts, right? This is obviously every single individual is going to differ here on what makes sense for his or her life. So I think the one kind of real rule, quote unquote, I say that we would strongly advocate is get your match.
Yep.
Get your match on your 401k if it's available. And then from there, you need to figure out what is going to work best for you, right? So obviously, if this person has significant loans that they might want to pay down quickly, a la Jonathan. If they have, some other life circumstance, they just absolutely need to have a 12-month emergency fund. And that helps them sleep well at night. Well, maybe that 20% of savings, right? Because that's what you set up originally here. You said this is somebody making about 60K. They have about 20%. So they have about $12,000 to work with. Where do they want to put that? What'll help them? Do they want to have that all in a 401k that theoretically they can access for some decent bit of time, potentially until they're 59 and a half? That might not make sense for a 22-year-old who's just getting started, who has zero, right? I think you can make a strong case to set up some type of emergency fund, or at least money that's accessible, right? That's maybe outside of a retirement vehicle, or maybe like Sean Mullaney, the FI tax guy, advocates, maybe a Roth IRA might not be a bad choice for that particular person, because contributions to a Roth IRA, you can take those out at any time, tax and penalty free. Okay. Now, this is not something, again, that we're advocating necessarily as this is your strategy when you set out with a Roth IRA, but it's nice to know it's there. So in that essence, it's this dual, it's a hybrid, right? It can operate as akin to an emergency fund in an emergency, a true emergency, or it's a long-term investment strategy. So I think that is kind of maybe splitting the difference a little bit. But again, each person needs to figure out what works for them. Maybe they want to pay $0 in federal income tax. Well, on a $60,000 income, if you can put $19,500 into your 401k, have some potentially other deductions plus the standard deduction, you might be getting closer to paying zero. Now, again, without knowing this person's situation, this hypothetical person, like I can't say, is that a good strategy? But you need to figure out what works for you and what helps you sleep at night. And I think for a lot of us, that emergency fund is probably where we're going to come down, at least at the beginning of our financial lives.
Like this. So yeah, you've kind of bridged the gap a little bit on the Roth. The one thing I was going to add there, because I think this is there's probably a lot of people in our community that kind of like these are numbers that feel kind of in reach. They version of what they're experiencing. You have this individual that's filing single, making around $60,000. They're setting up their 401k for the first time. They're trying to figure out how much to fund, and they're saying, all right, well, 20% of that would get me right around 12,000 a year. I still have some room. Do I want to throw everything into the 401k? Do I want to split the difference? But then even more than that, if you go one step deeper before we figure out how to bridge the gap, we say, what am I investing in? The 401k is just the vehicle. It's just the bucket. Like it's a tax treatment. Your employer sets it up for you in coordination with the federal government. It's something to encourage you to save for your own retirement. But that does not specify what you're in. You could be inside your 401k, inside of cash. You could be inside a money market account. You could be inside gold. You could be inside an annuity. You could be inside stocks. You could be inside bonds. You could be inside, any number of products could fit underneath those, but those would be taxed with this 401k treatment, meaning pre-tax. You don't pay any tax on it. It goes into the account pre-tax before the government's taxed it. It grows tax-free. And then when you draw it out at the retirement age, 59 and a half or beyond, it gets taxed at your marginal tax bracket at that point in time, like income. So this is just that it's a fundamental difference between the bucket that you're in, which now we're talking about a 401k, and then the actual investment vehicle that you're in, or the actual investment that you're in, which is, am I in stocks? Am I in bonds? Am I in some sort of alternative investment, an insurance product? These are all things that fit inside of it. And so I think if someone's picking it out, Brad, what I always did personally, and I'm just curious for you as well, is I got in the habit of just going to see if I could find something with the word index beside it and then looking to see what my options are. That was just my 80/20. Like there's a million options on there. Does anything say index? Because again, you don't have control. You don't get access to anything. It's what is your employer picks. I just look for index and then make a choice between those options.
Yeah, I think that that is a pretty good starting point. So I think another one, if you have your list of funds, you can generally see the expense ratios. So if your company gives you a document, in most cases, there's going to be a list of funds and this expense ratio. You're going to want to look for the one with the lowest expense ratio. Not that I'm saying pick that one by definition. That is clearly not what I'm saying. But I think that is going to clue you into what is most akin to a S&P 500 index fund or a total stock market index fund. I think that's usually going to be your best option, or at least a good starting place. So yeah, I mean, I think, Jonathan, your way of looking for index or total something, right? And then coupling that with, okay, can I really corroborate this easily with the ticker symbol, right? You're usually going to have a ticker symbol. You can go to Google and just type in that little symbol, VTSAX stock symbol, or or mutual fund symbol, something like that. Just Google that, and you're going to find out, hey, what is this? Because in a lot of cases, you really can't figure out very quickly what it is. So I think probably that's your starting point: is look for expense ratios that are low, look for the word index fund in some way, and then just do a little bit of research. But at least that culls it down from maybe 10, 20, 30 options that you might be seeing on this incomprehensible sheet of paper to, okay, now I've got 3 or 4 options that I can maybe spend 15 minutes looking into.
And if you take Brad and my advice on this, you're going to find out that they're the same thing. And that's by design. So if you look at index funds, you are going to self-select for the ones that have the lowest expense ratios. And if you look for the lowest expense ratios, you're going to self-select for the ones that are index funds. It's two halves of the same coin. There's a reason. And it's a very obvious reason when you think about it. It's actually understanding what an index fund is. So it's an index fund versus an actively managed fund. An actively managed fund has a team of people, highly compensated individuals, whose sole purpose is to beat the market returns in their chosen space, in their chosen sphere. And they charge you handsomely for that service. And that the way they charge you is in the form of an expense ratio. An index fund is quite the opposite. Now, there are indexes for indexes. So it's not all indexes are the same. It's not to say you stop when you see the word index, to Brad's point, or you don't stop when you see low expense ratio. But what an index fund is, for the segment that it is highlighting, for the segment that it is covering, it does not try to beat the market. It just tries to replicate whatever the market is doing inside of the niche that it's serving. So you could have an index for precious metals. You could have an index for the total stock market. You could have an index for the total world market. You could have an index for small cap, for medium cap, for large cap. You can have lots of index options. But what you will notice is almost one-to-one when paired or when compared to their actively managed counterparts, the expense ratio is a tiny fraction. So 4 basis points or 0.04% versus 0.4% or 1% or 2%. It's literally a difference 10 to 20 times less expensive than its actively managed counterpart because it's just following a computer algorithm. There's no team required. So it's really important for people to understand that that's not a coincidence. It's not a surprise. And that's why we're saying look for the lowest expense ratios, look for the lowest, because you think there's this person that's got it all figured out and they have the ins and outs and they can beat it. And the problem is they can't do it over time, but you're paying them the entire time, regardless of that truth.
Yep, agreed. And this is really the guiding light of how we approach our investing lives. And this is what I wish that I knew when I walked into that big bank and I got sold that 5% front-loaded fee, right? And I think for those of you listening, or those of you who have someone that's a family friend or coworker, whatever it is that you can help, like this is the way that we want to steer people, right? It's over the long term. This type of investing, low cost index fund investing, is going to give people a much higher likelihood of success, certainly than finding a fund with 2% assets under management, 2% expense ratio, or these crazy front end load fees. I can't even say the phrase, Jonathan. It's so abhorrent. Like it's how can we look for the best likelihood of success? And I think index funds helps you get there. And I think it also gives you some understanding of, what am I doing? I'm not just getting lucky. I'm not asking someone for some stock tip, right? And I think this is where you and I, reading the book, The Simple Path to Wealth, or reading the stock series at jlcollinsnh.com, and just getting an understanding of, okay, why are we investing? Why are we investing this way? Why do we think this gives us a very high likelihood of success over 30, 40, 50 years? I think that's kind of that 101 level that I'd love to pass across to somebody who is listening to this, who wants to get started.
All right, I think we're going to continue this conversation. I feel like there's a part two on this. We've really just started to scratch the surface on how to set up your financial life and really leaning into this investing component. We're going to continue this on an upcoming episode, so make sure you're subscribed. Brad, before we move on entirely, though, I thought maybe we could just take a second and talk about the interplay. We've talked about banking, we've talked about investments, we've talked about investment vehicles, credit cards, the overlap between credit cards and these systems. And I think many people are surprised maybe that we're not necessarily anti credit card, although we are anti-debt generally. Like that that's that there's an you have to be intellectually honest and say that it's because we understand a framework that we understand when something's a tool that can be used to win.
Yeah. Yeah. We are pro responsible uses of credit cards, but clearly with the understanding that tens of millions of people get into issues with credit cards. They get into debt and it turns into a spiral, right? We advocate if you can pay your credit card off on time and in full every single month, then it can be an extraordinary tool, not just because it's ease of use. Again, it goes back to not needing cash. There are safeguards on there where if there's fraud, you don't have to pay more than $50 per incident, right? It's essentially negligible. You have a 30-day interest-free loan on every purchase. You can set up automatic payments between your credit card and your bank so that you don't miss anything. Like you can set this up as a remarkable, remarkable tool, not to mention, obviously, Jonathan, travel rewards points, which is something that's, maybe another layer deep beyond the necessary 101. But you and I, in better times when we can travel, we're able to travel the world for nearly free using rewards points just because of our responsible use with credit cards. So for me, my credit cards have been the most positive financial tool that I've used over the last 10 years. But again, keeping in mind that I know millions of people who can't pay them off on time and in full have issues with that. So, I want to stress that and reiterate it as many times as I can without sounding ridiculous here. But so credit cards, how I use it in my own life, we pay as much as we possibly can with our credit cards. Because again, for all those reasons, the safety and security, the interest-free loan, the ease of not having to pay cash, like all this stuff, it's just a no-brainer for us because we know that we can pay that credit card bill on time and in full every month, right? And I've set up these safeguards where, like I said in passing there, when I open up a new credit card, I set up the auto pay option. Okay. So I link my checking account, which again is that central hub of my financial life. I set that up so that the credit card and the checking account are linked. And I've set it up to auto pay the full statement balance on the date the statement closes. Okay. So there is nothing that I can do to mess this up, right? I don't have to remember. I remember doing this years ago before I realized that auto pay was an option. Like realizing, oh man, this credit card closes on the 12th of the month and that one closes on the 22nd. I have to remember these things. Like my brain is puny, honestly, and I can't remember anything. I don't want to remember it. If I can set it up for auto pay, again, my structure is I keep a little bit extra in my checking account so I don't have to ever stress about these things. It just happens automatically. It happens in the background because I spent 5 minutes when I opened that credit card to set up this auto pay option. And I mean, that is as simple as can possibly be.
All right, my friends, I hope that was helpful. That was useful. We actually do have a free travel rewards course for those of you that are interested in kind of learning how to use these in the way that Brad described. Admittedly, none of us are really traveling right now, but we all know we are going to. So you don't really want to wait until you're ready to travel to start getting ready to travel. So if that's the case and you're interested, just go to choosefi.com/travel. We put together an amazing free course for you, which shows you how all this stuff breaks down, how to use it, how to leverage it. Please do so with the understanding that you are going to be a financially responsible card user and using these not as a tool. You're using these as a tool, not as a crutch. And then, yeah, with that being said, I hope this is useful. Please stay tuned. We're going to be releasing the next part in this series over the next couple of weeks, part 2, and how to set up your financial life. A important conversation and a larger conversation about how to build a life that will lead towards financial independence. All right, my friends, the fire is spreading. We'll see you next time as we continue to go down the road less traveled.